Hello everyone, I'm Arunima from Knit-A-Knotter, and in this video I'm going to talk about make how to make something using the corner to corner entrelac technique. So here is a square that I made using that technique. So you start from one corner and you work your way up to the other corner and you make it in diagonals. So you see that the diagonals are of the same color. So I started with this square, and then I made these two squares in a diagonal, and then these and these, and then lastly that one. So I'm going to show you how to make this in this video, and let's get started. So here's a little chart that I made for you to see. This is the pattern I'm going to follow. I wanted you to see that there are basically 4 kinds of squares that you can make that form this little square that I've made here. So there is this first square which is indicated by 1 dot. That's the first square that you'll make. Then you'd make this one that's indicated by 2 dots. Then there's the third one, and after you make those, then you start again here. So this square and this square are pretty much the same. They're made the same way. The fourth, this square indicated by 4 dots, is going to be slightly different as compared to all the others we've made so far. And then you'll make this one exactly the same as this. So I've indicated all of these squares with dots, so you can see that except for the ones on the sides. So you start with one. Any squares that you make over here, they'll be the exact same kind, the one with the 2 dots. If anything you make here, if you even extend this further up, all those will be the same as 3 dots. And any other squares that you make over here, if you had say a 5 by 5 or a 10 by 10 square, all these squares on this side will be made exactly the same way, and they'll be the type 4 block. So I'm going to talk about that in detail as I'm making this. So you'll see what the difference between those blocks is. There's a very small difference between all of these, and it really is a very simple technique. So let's get started. So I'm going to begin with making this first square over here. For the purpose of this video, my squares are going to be they're going to be 5 stitches wide and 7 stitches wide and 5 rows in length. So 7 stitches by 5 rows, and I'm going to start with the first one, which is this one, and it's in color white, and it's of type 1. So type 1 means, well, I'm going to call it by type number of dots. So type 1 is this one, this would be type 2, this would be type 3. So starting with type 1, I'm going to start with making a chain 7. So that's my foundation block. So that's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I make my foundation row stitches in the back loops of the chain, and I have a separate tutorial for showing you how to make the foundation row, and you're welcome to check that out. I'm not going to talk about it in detail here, just that I prefer to make my foundation row stitches in the back loop here. So here we go. That's the first, that's the forward pass of the foundation row, and that's my foundation row. So I'm going to make a total of 5 rows here. So here's after completing 5 rows, and I'm going to make my bind off row. So I'm going to do a complete independent square of Tunisian simple stitches, 7 stitches, 5 rows, and I'm going to go all the way to completing this block by making the bind off row. So that's how it looks, and that is my this square. That's the first one. So I'm going to now cut the yarn and fasten off. I'm not going to be weaving in ends at this point, maybe after another diagonal, but this is how it looks right now. At this point I'm going to start making the second diagonal, which is the diagonal of blue squares, and to make this I'm going to attach my blue yarn right here. So I'm going to start making the squares on this side. So this is type 1. Now we're going to make a type 2, so you'll see how it is different from this one. So this is a completely independent square, and you'll only make one of these in the entire panel that you make. The type 2 is where you will attach your square with a previously existing square from the side, from the edge, this edge, and I'll show you how to do that. So you'll use the join as you go technique to do this. I have a separate tutorial to explain that in detail, but you just have to attach your yarn here, and since I had 7 stitches, so I'm going to make a chain 6 in this case. So 1 2 3 4 5 6, make my foundation row stitches in the back loops here. So I have 6 loops on my hook now. That's 2 4 6 because I did a chain 6, and now the 7th one will be made by joining with the first row of the previous square that's right here, and you insert your hook, yarn over, pull through. So that gives you 7 loops, 2 4 6 7. So that makes 7 stitches, the 7th one being the one that is made by joining with the previous square. So I'm going to yarn over, pull through 2 all the way to the beginning, and I'm going to make a total of 5 rows, the same number of rows as this square here, and the last stitch will be made by joining with the next row of that square. So this was the first row, now I'm going to join with the next one. So you can see the difference between the type A square and a type 1 square and a type 2 square. In the type 1 square, it was an independent square and there was no joining involved. And in this square, we're joining at by rows. So here, I'm going to go ahead and make all 5 rows. So your number of rows will be the exact same in this square and this square. And I'm going to, after making 5 rows, I'm going to make the bind off row using slip stitches. Again, I have a separate tutorial for this row if you are interested in figuring out how to make the bind off row. And then we go ahead and join with the first slip stitch from that previous square, and that's it. That completes this square right here. This one is done. So you see the difference between the two. This was type 1, this was type 2, and now I'm going to make a type 3, which will be right on top of this here, which will be again different from either one of these that we've made. So this was attached to the first square by rows, this one will be attached by stitches. So this will count as my first stitch, and Now there are two things that you can do over here. You can either make your stitches in these bind off stitches that you made, or you can continue making your stitches here as if you were continuing this panel and making simple stitches on top of existing stitches. You can choose either. It will be a different effect if you make them here versus here. I like to make my stitches in the simple stitches of the previous square, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to insert my hook in the simple stitch, yarn over, pull through, and continue all the way till the end. So you see that here with this square we joined by rows, and with this square we're joining by stitches. So here I'm going to have 7 loops on my hook, and then the last one is just like a regular last stitch of any regular row. So that's 2, 4, 6, 7 stitches, and I'm going to make my return pass. And there is no row join here, so there's no square right here to join with, so that's why this is different from the other two. So I'm going to go ahead and make a total of 5 rows. And that's 5 rows, and I'm going to make a bind off row. And that's it. So that completes that diagonal here, right here, this one. So that's I made one type 1, one type 2, and one type 3 square. So the 3 squares, all 3 have been different, and there's one more square type that we'll introduce, but that'll be pretty much it. That's all you'll need to know to make an entrelac square. So at this point I'm going to cut my yarn. So I cut my yarn at the end of every diagonal before I reattach new yarn and start from the other end. So I'm always going to start at this end and going to end at the top there. So I always start from here, go all the way to the top. That's how I work my squares. So at this point I could choose to weave in ends, or I can keep going. Another thing to note here is that you can make all the diagonals of different colors. This one can be different from this, can be different from this. For this tutorial I just chose 2 colors, so I'm alternating diagonals, but you can pick any colors you want to make this with. So one thing to note here is that with every diagonal until now, well, we've just had count this also as 1, so we just had 2, and we had one square here, and then we added another, so there's 2 squares here. So we're sort of increasing the number of squares, and that's why we have this type 2 and type 3 squares. But as we go further, you'll see that when we start reducing the number of squares in our diagonals, that's when the squares number 2 and 3 sort of go away. So I'll get to that when we get to that point, but for now let's start making this third diagonal here. So I'll start with a type 2 square, which was exactly the same as this one that we just made, where you'll join the square as you're making it row wise with this previous square. So I'm going to go ahead and attach my yarn. So just so you know, this is the one we were making now. I'm going to make 6 chains, because the 7th one will be the one that I join with the previous square. Here we go. So that's the first, or the foundation row, and then I'm just going to make 5 more rows on top of this, just like I made it with this square, and the 7th stitch in each of these rows will be a join with the previous square. That's the end of 5 rows, and I'm going to make a bind off row. And we're going to join this with the first slip stitch of the previous row. This can sometimes be tight, and what I like to do in that case is I use another smaller hook and I just pull that yarn with a smaller hook. It makes it easy. I don't have to struggle with the existing stitches. One way to handle this is that when you make your first slip stitch here, this one, leave the loop a little loose, but a lot of times I forget to do that, and that's fine because I can just use a smaller hook and use just to pull the yarn through. So that's the end of that square, and you see that this and these two squares were made exactly the same way, and that's why I've called them type 2, and or call them the same type. Now at this point I'm going to make a square which is a type 4, which is the center square, which will be joined with this square at the stitches by stitches, and with this square by rows. So there's two squares to join with at the same time. So this counts as the first stitch, and I'm going to make 5 stitches. 3, 4, 5. So the first one was the one that we already had on the hook. We made 5 more, so that makes it 6, and the last one will be the one where we join with this square. So that's the 7th. So that's 7 loops. 2, 4, 6, 7 loops on the hook at this point. And we yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, all the way to the beginning. So I'm going to go ahead and make 5 rows with the join, row-wise join with this square here. And making the bind off row now. And that's it. That completes the type 4 square. That's the one here right at the center. So you can see that a type 4 square is different from the previous 3 types that we've made, in that it's joined on both sides, one by stitches and one by rows. And this is the most common type of block that you will make in corner to corner, because everything that's made on the right side of an existing diagonal is all of the same type, where you will be making squares where you're joining both row wise and stitch wise. Now going back to where we were, now we've made this square, and now we're going to make this one, which is type 3, which is the exact same as this, where you're only joining with the previous square stitch wise. So you'll have to make that last stitch just as you normally would in any other project where you have to, where you're not joining. So I'm going to make these. So the first stitch counts as the one that was already on the loop, on the hook, and then I'm going to make 6 more. So that's 2, 4, 6, and 7 stitches. I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to keep making rows of simple stitches. So I'm going to make 5 rows, and there'll be 5 rows of 7 stitches at the end of this at the end in this square. And now the bind off row. So that completes this third diagonal here. So this diagonal and this diagonal, they're the same. I used the same color as the square, but you could have chosen a different color. But you can see that after you complete a square, the yarn ends up at the other end, and you can start making your square at a located at a diagonal from the previous one. So that's how you can keep growing your C2C panels. I'm going to cut the yarn now, and I'm going to fasten off, and I'm going to skip weaving in ends even now. I'm just going to continue making this. So now you can see that here, just to give you an idea, if you were to increase this at the top and not on the side, you could just keep adding more type 3 squares on top, and you'll make a rectangle which is long here. The height will be more than the width, and if you wanted to make it wider than taller, so you could just keep adding type 2 blocks here without adding any type 3 blocks at the top, and you'll get a panel that's wider than it's longer. So now if you look at what's remaining is only type 4 blocks. That is because now we're starting to reduce. We're not increasing on any side. We're not making a rectangle, we're making a square, so we're going to reduce, and that means we're not going to add a type 2 here or a type 3 here. So this square is exactly the same as this one, and it's a type 4 where you have to join stitch wise and row wise with 2 existing squares. So I'm going to go ahead and do that with blue yarn again. To now, instead of attaching over here with this block here, I'm going to attach over here so that I can make my square over there. So I'm going to attach with this first stitch here from the previous square. That counts as my first. That counts as my first stitch of that row, and then I'm going to just continue making simple stitches. So that's 1. I'm going to make 5 stitches. So the first one that was the one that was the join, and then I'm going to make 5 by joining stitchwise with the existing square. And then the last one will be made by joining with row wise with that other square. And now that's done, I'm just going to continue making 4 more rows. That'll make a total of 5 rows by joining row wise with this square on the other side. So that's 5 rows, and I'm going to now make my bind off row. And join with that previous square. So that join is the 7th stitch. It's a little tight, so I'm just going to use my other hook. Yarn over, pull through, and that's it. That completes that first square of that diagonal. So this square is this one. It was type 4, so you could see it was exactly the same as this. Now I'm going to make this one, which is over here. Again, I have to attach it with stitch-wise with this one and row-wise with this one. And this loop counts as the first stitch, and I'm going to make 5 stitches by joining with this. And one last stitch by joining row-wise with that other square. So that completes that part, these 2 diagonals, and I'm going to cut the yarn now. Fasten off. So if I wanted to, I could have made another type 3 over here and extended it on this side, and that would have made a rectangle as I explained earlier. But for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm just going to keep it a square. And now we've got just 1 square left. Again, that's the kind where we have to join with 2 existing squares, and that's a type 4, and I'm going to go ahead and make it with color white. So I'm going to join the white. That counts as my first stitch, and I'm going to make 5 simple stitches by joining with the previous square, and 1 by joining here with row-wise with that other square on the side. And I'm going to make 5 rows. And join with the previous one. And that's it. I'm going to cut this yarn. And that's how it looks. And after I weave in ends, this is how it will be. So that's that's pretty much it about the corner to corner technique. There's only these 4 kinds of squares that you need to know how to make, and you can make pretty much any corner to corner entrelac panel with this. And you can modify the number of stitches and number of rows to make larger or smaller squares, or you could even make rectangles, whichever works for you, whatever your pattern calls for. But it really is just these 4 different kinds of squares that you need to know how to make. I hope you found this tutorial useful, and I hope to see you in my other tutorials. Bye bye.